The flight left without him. Not because of a scheduling error. Not because of a miscommunication between the travel staff and the terminal. Not because of any of the ordinary, logistical reasons that occasionally separate professional athletes from team flights during the grinding middle stretch of a long season. The flight left without Shohei Ohtani because Shohei Ohtani could not walk to the gate. That detail, small, precise, devastating in its implication, did not come from the Dodgers organization. It did not come from a league source or a team official or anyone whose job description includes managing the flow of information out of a professional baseball franchise. It came from the airport. A witness. An ordinary person in an ordinary terminal who happened to be present at the moment when one of the most recognizable athletes on the planet sat down in a chair near a departure gate and did not get up. Who watched the boarding process begin and continue and conclude. Who watched the gate agent make a call. Who watched two men in Dodgers-adjacent credentials arrive and crouch beside Ohtani and speak to him in low, urgent voices. Who watched the plane pull back from the jetway while Ohtani was still in the chair. By the time that account reached the first reporter who treated it seriously enough to pursue, Ohtani was already in a car heading back toward Los Angeles. The return journey that nobody had planned and nobody had announced, and that meant something far more serious than a missed connection. It meant the knee had gotten worse. The GM called the press conference for 9 a.m. He had been awake, according to a person familiar with his schedule, since shortly after 3 a.m., the hour when the situation at the airport had escalated from concerning to critical and the calls had started arriving on his phone in rapid, sleepless succession. He walked into the room alone. That was the first signal. Roberts was not present. Pryor was not present. The organizational support structure that typically flanks a GM during difficult announcements was absent. Just one man, one microphone, one table, and a room full of reporters who had been filing urgent updates since before sunrise. He sat down. Did not open a folder. Did not arrange notes. Looked directly at the assembled press. "I'm going to cover several things this morning," he said. "I'm going to ask that you hold questions until I've finished, because the information is connected, and it will make more sense if I go through it in sequence." Nobody objected. Nobody moved. He began. The knee, he explained, had not stabilized the way the medical team had projected following the initial specialist consultation. The swelling that had been present at the time of the MRI had not reduced at the expected rate. During the night before the team's departure for Chicago, Ohtani had experienced a significant increase in pain that had triggered an emergency home visit from the team physician. That visit had produced a recommendation. The recommendation had been that Ohtani should not travel. Ohtani had disagreed. The GM paused at that point. Allowed the information to settle. Shohei made the decision, independently, to attempt to make the flight, he said. He informed the travel coordinator that he would be at the airport. He arrived at the airport. Another pause. He did not make the flight. His body made that decision for him, at the gate, in a way that, the GM stopped. In a way that removed the question from his hands. The room was very quiet. He is back in Los Angeles. He is with our medical team. The specialist has been contacted and will conduct a follow-up assessment this afternoon. He folded his hands on the table. I also need to address something else. Mark Pryor had been with the Dodgers for long enough that his name had become embedded in the team's identity in the way that certain coaches' names do, not because of individual fame, but because of the texture of trust that builds between a pitching staff and the person responsible for it over years of proximity. He was not a headline figure. He was something more valuable and more quiet than that. He was, until Saturday evening, the Dodgers' pitching coach. The GM delivered the news without preamble. Mark Pryor is no longer with the organization. That decision was made yesterday evening and communicated to Mark directly. I want to be honest with you about the reason, because I think the situation demands honesty and I think Mark deserves to have the truth told rather than a version of it. He took a breath. During the course of the league's investigation, and subsequently through our own internal review, information emerged about what Pryor knew regarding Shohei's knee condition, specifically, the timeline of his knowledge and certain communications, or the absence of certain communications, that occurred in the weeks before the incident. A reporter made a movement. The GM held up a hand slightly. I asked for questions at the end. Please. He continued. What the review revealed was that Pryor had information about the degree of Shohei's discomfort that was more specific, and more recent, than what had been communicated to the medical staff through the standard reporting channels. He had information that came directly from Shohei, shared in the way that players sometimes share things with coaches that they don't share with doctors, because the relationship is different, because the trust is different, and a judgment call was made about what to do with that information. He paused. The judgment call was wrong. The information should have been escalated. It wasn't. And while I understand the complexity of the position Pryor was in, the trust that Shohei placed in him, the difficulty of acting on information shared in confidence, the outcome of that decision contributed to a situation in which Shohei competed at a level of risk that the organization would not have sanctioned had we known the full picture. He let that sentence exist in the room for a moment before continuing. Mark Pryor is a good coach and a decent person. This decision was not made in anger. It was made because accountability matters, and because the people responsible for Shohei's well-being need to be held to a standard that this situation revealed was not met. He stopped. Questions. The questions came fast. The GM answered most of them with the same controlled directness he had maintained throughout. On the specific nature of the communications between Pryor and Ohtani, he said only that the review had established their content and that sharing further detail would not serve anyone's interests. On whether Ohtani had been consulted about Pryor's dismissal, he paused longer than he had paused at any other point in the conference. Shohei was informed, he said. He was not consulted. Those are different things. This was an organizational decision, made by the organization, and it would not have been appropriate to ask a player, any player, to share responsibility for a personnel outcome. A reporter asked if Ohtani had expressed a view. The GM looked at the question carefully. Shohei expressed that he did not want anyone to lose their position because of him, he said. That is consistent with everything I know about who he is. A pause. It is also not how organizations operate, and I told him so. Mamiko had been in Los Angeles for 4 days. That detail had not been publicly known. The Dodgers had not announced her presence and she had not been visible at the stadium or at any of the public-facing events that occasionally bring players' families into the organizational periphery. She had arrived quietly, without announcement, in the way that people arrive when the reason for the visit is not something anyone is celebrating. She had been at the house when Ohtani returned from the airport. A source close to the situation, not a team official, not a league source, someone whose connection to the family is personal rather than professional, described what happened when Ohtani came through the door. He was limping worse than he had been in the photograph outside Cedars-Sinai. The airport, the car, the return journey, the hours of activity against medical advice, had cost him something visible. He came through the door and Mamiko saw him and the source said she went pale in a way that people who know her describe as entirely uncharacteristic. She did not faint. That matters to say clearly. But she came close enough that the people present moved toward her instinctively, the way people move when a body's equilibrium suddenly becomes uncertain. She had seen the photograph from outside the hospital. She had seen the footage. She had been processing the public version of her husband's condition for days. But the public version, it turned out, had not fully prepared her for the private one. For seeing him walk through their door. For what a limp looks like when it belongs to someone you love and you are standing close enough to hear his breathing. Ohtani's assessment was scheduled for 2 p.m. Roberts, who had not appeared at the morning press conference, issued a single written statement through the organization in the early afternoon. It was 4 sentences. It expressed confidence in the medical team. It expressed confidence in Ohtani's recovery. It stated that the organization's position remained unchanged, no baseball activity until the specialist consultation produced a revised protocol. The fourth sentence was not organizational language. It did not read like something that had been reviewed by a communications team before distribution. It read like something Roberts had written himself, without assistance, and submitted before anyone could soften it. It said, "He tried to get on that plane." That tells you everything about him. Our job now is to make sure he doesn't have to fight us to take care of himself. The flight to Chicago had taken off on schedule. The Dodgers were in the visiting clubhouse at Guaranteed Rate Field, preparing for a game that would happen without their best player, managed by a man who had issued a public statement from a distance of 2,000 miles. In Los Angeles, in a specialist's office on a Friday afternoon, Shohei Ohtani was finding out what his knee was going to tell him next. Mamiko was in the waiting room. The door was closed. And whatever came through it next would determine not just a timeline but the shape of a season that had already been altered in ways that nobody, not the GM, not Roberts, not the three players whose baseball lives had ended in a league announcement, had been able to fully anticipate when it began.